Everyone attends Jimin's wedding, until Jungkook arrives with a hidden secret that transforms love, destiny, and the wedding's unforgettable ending forever. The church doors slammed open with a force that echoed through the marble hall before anyone could say another word. Every head turned at once. The string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a note, leaving a silence so heavy it almost hurt. Sunlight poured through the entrance behind the lone figure standing there, turning him into a dark silhouette against the glowing afternoon. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the whispers began. Jungkook. The name travelled from one row of guests to another like a ripple across still water. Jimin froze at the altar. His fingers instinctively tightened around the bouquet until several white petals slipped silently onto the polished floor. He had spent months convincing himself this moment would never happen. Jungkook had disappeared almost a year earlier without a farewell, without a single explanation, leaving behind nothing except unanswered messages and a silence that grew heavier every passing day. Yet now he stood at the entrance wearing a black suit dampened by rain, his hair slightly disheveled, his breathing uneven as though he had run through an entire city just to reach this place before it was too late. The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Some recognized him immediately, while others only sensed that whoever this man was, he carried a history that belonged inside this ceremony. Jimin's fiancée slowly turned toward him, confusion replacing the joyful smile she had worn only moments earlier. She looked from Jungkook to Jimin and realized there was an invisible conversation happening between them before either of them had spoken a single word. Jungkook lowered his eyes briefly, almost unable to meet Jimin's gaze. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but his hands trembled despite every effort to steady them. Hidden beneath his jacket was an old leather folder protected carefully from the rain. It looked worn from years of being carried, its edges softened by time. Jimin recognized it instantly. Years ago, they had bought matching folders during a trip neither of them had ever talked about afterward. He remembered laughing when Jungkook insisted that every important promise deserved a safe place. Jimin had forgotten that conversation. Jungkook clearly had not. Minister hesitated before clearing his throat softly, unsure whether to continue the ceremony or wait. No one moved. Even the children sitting near the front sensed the unusual tension hanging in the air. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the grey sky as gentle rain tapped rhythmically against the stained glass windows. The fragrance of fresh lilies mixed with the scent of wet earth drifting in through the open doorway, creating an atmosphere that felt strangely nostalgic. Jungkook finally stepped forward. Every footstep echoed through the silent church, each one sounding heavier than the last. He stopped halfway down the aisle, leaving several meters between himself and the altar. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "I'm not here to stop the wedding." Those words immediately softened several anxious faces among the guests. Jimin's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, yet the uncertainty in his eyes remained. Jungkook continued. "I promised myself I would never interrupt your happiness. I only came because something belongs to you, and today is the last day I can keep it." He slowly removed the leather folder from beneath his jacket. Despite the rain outside, it remained perfectly dry. He had protected it more carefully than himself. Jimin stared at it without blinking. Memories surfaced one after another. Long nights spent writing impossible dreams. Quiet promises whispered beneath endless summer skis. A friendship tested by distance, silence, pride, and choices neither of them had been mature enough to understand. Jungkook carefully held the folder with both hands, almost reverently, as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. "I've carried this everywhere," he admitted. "Every city, every apartment, every country I visited." A faint smile crossed his lips, but it carried years of exhaustion behind it. "I thought one day I'd find the courage to give it back. I kept failing." Jimin's heartbeat pounded in his ears. His fiancée noticed his expression changing, watched old memories quietly returning to his face, and realized there were entire chapters of his life she had never known existed. Jungkook looked directly into Jimin's eyes for the first time since entering the church. There was no anger inside them, no accusation, only a quiet sadness that had long ago learned how to coexist with hope. "I never wanted you to remember me because of regret," he said softly. "I wanted you to remember that once, before life became complicated, we were fearless enough to believe promises could outlive time." The church remained utterly still. Even the rain seemed to soften outside, as though nature itself had paused to listen. Jimin slowly stepped away from the altar without realizing it, one cautious step, then another. No one tried to stop him. His shoes echoed gently across the marble until only a short distance separated the two men. For the first time in months, they stood face to face. Older, wiser, carrying invisible scars no one else in the room could fully understand. Jungkook extended the leather folder toward him with shaking hands. "Whatever happens after today," he whispered, "this has always been yours." Jimin accepted it carefully. The leather felt familiar beneath his fingertips, carrying the warmth of countless journeys. He hesitated before opening it, sensing that whatever rested inside had quietly survived years of silence, waiting patiently for this exact moment. Jimin's fingers lingered on the worn leather cover, as though opening it too quickly might erase whatever fragile connection had survived the passing years. The church remained silent, filled only with the soft patter of rain against the stained glass windows and the distant rumble of thunder fading into the horizon. Every guest watched without daring to whisper. Even the photographer lowered the camera, instinctively sensing that some moments were too sacred to interrupt with the sound of a shutter. Slowly, Jimin loosened the weathered strap and lifted the cover. The faint scent of aged paper drifted into the air, carrying with it memories of libraries, train stations, coffee shops, and nights illuminated only by desk lamps and impossible dreams. The first page held nothing but a single handwritten sentence in Jungkook's unmistakable handwriting. "If you are reading this today, it means fate chose a path neither of us could predict." Jimin swallowed hard. He remembered that handwriting instantly. Every letter leaned slightly to the right, neat but carrying a restless energy that mirrored the man who had written it. Beneath the first page rested dozens of folded letters, each carefully labeled with a different year. They stretched back almost a decade. None of them had ever been opened. None had ever reached their intended reader. Jimin looked up, unable to hide the confusion filling his eyes. Jungkook gave a small, weary smile. "I wrote one every year," he said quietly. "I never found the courage to send them." The words settled over the church like falling snow. Jimin carefully unfolded the earliest letter. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained clear. It spoke of ordinary things: a tiny apartment, sleepless nights chasing ambitions, favorite songs that reminded Jungkook of better days, and the hope that somewhere in the world Jimin was smiling. There was no bitterness, no blame. Only an honest record of a friendship that had refused to disappear, even in silence. As Jimin continued reading, the years unfolded before him. One letter described Jungkook standing alone on a snowy bridge, wondering whether some promises survived distance. Another confessed that every birthday, no matter where he was, he still bought 2 slices of strawberry cake out of habit, before remembering he was eating alone. One letter admitted he had nearly called dozens of times, but always ended the call before it connected, afraid that hearing Jimin's voice would make moving forward impossible. The guests could not read the words, yet they saw the effect they had. Jimin's breathing grew uneven. His shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly. The confident smile he had worn at the beginning of the ceremony slowly disappeared, replaced by an expression that seemed to carry years of forgotten emotion. His fiancée watched quietly, her own eyes softening. She realized these were not love letters written to steal someone away. They were pieces of a life someone had never stopped carrying. Jungkook lowered his gaze toward the polished floor. "I wasn't protecting myself," he admitted after a long silence. "I was protecting you. I thought if I stayed away you could build a life without looking back." Jimin closed the letter gently and looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" His voice was barely louder than a whisper. Jungkook released a slow breath, because sometimes loving someone means accepting that they deserve peace more than answers. Those words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. No one in the church seemed capable of moving. Outside, the rain gradually slowed until only scattered drops traced delicate paths across the stained glass, allowing golden afternoon sunlight to filter back into the sanctuary. The colored light painted soft patterns across the marble floor, transforming the solemn atmosphere into something unexpectedly warm. Jimin reached deeper into the folder. Beneath the letters rested a small velvet pouch tied with a faded blue ribbon. His heartbeat quickened. Carefully, he untied the ribbon and tipped the contents into his palm. A silver key shimmered beneath the sunlight. It was old, its intricate design unlike any modern key. Attached to it was a tiny wooden tag engraved with 2 simple words: * our beginning. Jimin stared at it, searching his memory until recognition suddenly washed across his face. Years ago, during one carefree summer afternoon, he and Jungkook had hidden a small wooden box inside an abandoned lakeside cabin. They had filled it with handwritten dreams, photographs, ticket stubs, and promises they believed would someday remind them of who they once were. Before locking the box, they had agreed on one impossible rule. The key would stay with Jungkook, and the box would never be opened unless life separated them long enough to forget each other. Neither of them had imagined that day would ever come. A quiet laugh escaped Jimin, quickly dissolving into tears. "You kept it all this time," he murmured. Jungkook nodded. "I couldn't throw away the only proof that once we believed the future would be kinder than the past." Jimin closed his fingers around the silver key. It felt surprisingly warm, as though it had absorbed years of hope from the hand that had protected it. Around them, the guests began to understand that the greatest secret Jungkook had brought to the wedding was not a shocking revelation or a hidden scandal. It was the weight of memories preserved with extraordinary patience, waiting for the day they could finally be returned to the person they had always belonged to. The atmosphere inside the church shifted almost imperceptibly. The celebration no longer felt like a simple wedding ceremony. It had become something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement that some bonds, no matter how much time passes, continue to shape the people who carry them, not by demanding a different future, but by honoring a shared past that refused to be forgotten. The silver key rested quietly in Jimin's palm, its worn edges pressing gently against his skin, as though reminding him that time could weather metal but not every promise attached to it. For several long seconds, he said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny wooden tag engraved with ***, while countless forgotten memories slowly resurfaced with remarkable clarity. He remembered the old lakeside cabin hidden beyond a narrow forest trail, the scent of pine trees after summer rain, the laughter that echoed across the quiet water, and two young dreamers convinced that the future would always leave room for each other. A faint smile appeared on Jimin's face before fading almost immediately. "I thought that cabin was gone," he whispered. Jungkook gently shook his head. "No." His answer was simple. "I went back every year." The confession spread through the church like a gentle wave. "Every year?" Jimin asked, unable to hide his surprise. Jungkook nodded. "I repaired the roof after the first winter damaged it. I replaced the broken windows. I cleaned the floor every spring. I made sure the box stayed dry." Several guests exchanged emotional glances. "It sounds ridiculous now," Jungkook continued with a quiet laugh. "Taking care of an empty cabin because of a promise made years ago." "It isn't ridiculous," an elderly guest murmured softly from the back pew, almost without realizing she had spoken aloud. Jungkook smiled politely before looking back at Jimin. "I wasn't protecting the cabin." He paused. "I was protecting the version of us that still believed impossible things could happen." Silence settled once more. The minister lowered his head respectfully, sensing that this conversation had become something larger than the ceremony he had been invited to conduct. Jimin carefully placed the key back inside the velvet pouch before reaching deeper into the folder. Near the bottom lay a small envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Unlike the others, no year was written across the front. Only 5 handwritten words. "Open only on your wedding day." Jimin's heartbeat stumbled. His fingers froze above the seal. "You knew," he whispered. Jungkook gave a small nod. "I didn't know when." His voice remained calm. "But I believed one day someone would make you smile the way you deserved." Jimin stared at him. "So you wrote this before you even knew who?" "I wrote it because I knew life would keep moving." The room became impossibly quiet. Very slowly, Jimin broke the wax seal. Inside rested a single folded page. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting remained steady from the first word to the last. "Dear Jimin, if today is truly your wedding day, then I hope you're smiling before you even finish reading this." Jimin instinctively wiped away another tear. "If you're happy, don't let my arrival confuse your heart. I never came here to ask for another chance. Some stories become beautiful because they end exactly where they're meant to." His breathing grew slower. "There was a time when I believed I had to stay beside you forever to prove our friendship mattered. I was wrong. Real love, whether friendship or something deeper, isn't measured by distance. It's measured by what remains after distance has done its worst." Several guests quietly lowered their eyes. Even those who had never met Jungkook before felt the sincerity inside every sentence. "You once asked me what kind of person I wanted to become. Back then I answered that I wanted to become someone unforgettable. Years later I realized I had the wrong dream. I only wanted to become someone whose kindness you would remember whenever life became difficult." Jimin's vision blurred again. His fiancée stood only a few steps away. She watched him carefully, not with jealousy but with compassion. She had never seen him this vulnerable. The final paragraph waited at the bottom of the page. There's one more secret inside this folder. Not because it belongs to me. Because it belongs to your future. Jimin slowly reached beneath the letter. There was another envelope. This one was noticeably newer. His name appeared on the front together with another name. Not Jungkook's. His fiancée's. Jimin looked up in confusion. Jungkook smiled for what felt like the first genuine time that afternoon. I met her once, he admitted. Both Jimin and his fiancée stared at him. It was months before your engagement. Her eyebrows lifted. The charity hospital. Jungkook nodded. She suddenly covered her mouth. It was you. No one else understood. Jimin looked between them. What hospital? His fiancée struggled to find her voice. A little girl needed emergency surgery. She swallowed. The family couldn't afford it. Jungkook quietly looked away. I happened to be there. She continued softly. The donor refused to leave his name. Jungkook smiled awkwardly. It wasn't important. Tears welled in her eyes. You paid everything. He shrugged gently. I had the ability to help. She shook her head. No, her voice cracked. You didn't just help her. She looked directly at Jimin. The doctors said that child wouldn't have survived another week. The guests stared in stunned silence. Jimin looked at Jungkook as though seeing him for the first time. You never told anyone. Jungkook laughed quietly. If kindness becomes a story about the person who gave it. He looked toward the stained glass windows where sunlight now filled the church. Then the person who received it disappears. No one spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because every heart inside the church had begun to understand that the greatest secret Jungkook had carried to the wedding was never hidden inside the folder. It had been quietly carried inside himself all along, revealed not through dramatic declarations, but through years of silent loyalty, selfless compassion. And promises kept when no one was watching. The church no longer felt like a place reserved only for a wedding ceremony. It had become a sanctuary where years of silence were finally finding their voices. Warm afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the marble floor like fragments of forgotten memories. No one seemed eager to leave the moment behind. Jimin carefully folded Jungkook's letter and returned it to the envelope with almost ceremonial care. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as though the paper had become something far more fragile than ink and parchment. When he looked up again, his eyes no longer held confusion. They held understanding. You've been carrying all of this alone, Jimin said softly. Jungkook offered a faint smile. I thought that was the easiest way. It wasn't. No. A quiet laugh escaped him. It wasn't. For the first time since Jungkook had entered the church, the tension between them began to dissolve into something gentler. The weight of years remained, but it no longer felt sharp. It felt like an old scar, still visible, yet no longer painful to touch. Jimin's fiancée slowly stepped forward until she stood beside him. She faced Jungkook with sincere gratitude in her eyes. I've been wondering for months who saved that little girl. Jungkook lowered his gaze. I didn't save her. You gave her a chance. The doctors saved her. She smiled through tears. You're still refusing to take credit. He answered with a shy shrug. I've always been uncomfortable with attention. Jimin couldn't help smiling. That part of you never changed. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the guests, breaking the solemn atmosphere for the first time that afternoon. An elderly aunt standing near the second row quietly wiped her eyes. I've never seen a wedding like this, she whispered to her husband. He nodded. Neither have I. Near the entrance, a young violinist slowly lifted his instrument again. Without waiting for instructions, he began playing a soft melody. Soon the pianist joined him. The music filled the church with quiet warmth, wrapping itself around every conversation like a comforting embrace. Jimin looked toward the altar. The flowers, the candles, the smiling faces of family and friends. Everything he had imagined for this day was still there. Only now he understood something he had overlooked while planning every perfect detail. A wedding was not only about beginning a new chapter. It was also about making peace with every chapter that came before. He turned back to Jungkook. "I owe you more than an apology." Jungkook gently shook his head. "No, I disappeared from your life. You were trying to build your future. I should have searched harder. You searched. I gave up. You survived." Jimin's eyes lowered. "I'm not proud of that." Jungkook stepped closer until only a short distance separated them. "I used to think losing people meant they stopped caring." He smiled sadly. "Life taught me something different." "What?" "Sometimes people disappear because they're carrying burdens they don't know how to explain." Jimin felt those words settle deep inside him. He remembered the years after they had drifted apart. The endless work. The expectations. The exhaustion. The nights when reaching out felt simple yet impossible. Perhaps both of them had been waiting for the other to take the first step. Neither ever had. Until today. Jimin slowly extended his hand. For a second, Jungkook simply stared at it. Then he accepted it. Their handshake lasted only a moment before Jimin unexpectedly pulled him into a firm embrace. The entire church watched in silence. No dramatic speeches followed. No applause interrupted them. Only the quiet sound of two old friends standing still after carrying years of unfinished conversations. Jungkook hesitated at first. Then his arms slowly returned the embrace. His eyes closed. "So this," he whispered with a small laugh, "is what closure feels like." Jimin smiled. "No." He gently stepped back. "This feels like finding someone you never actually lost." A few guests discreetly wiped tears from their cheeks. Even the minister smiled. "I've officiated hundreds of weddings," he said quietly. "But today I've witnessed something just as sacred." The bride reached for Jimin's hand again. He intertwined his fingers with hers. She looked toward Jungkook. "I understand now." Jungkook tilted his head slightly. "You aren't here to take anything away." "No, you came to give something back." He smiled. "I promised myself I'd leave lighter than I arrived." She reached into the bouquet she had been holding throughout the ceremony. Nestled among the white roses was a single lavender flower. She carefully removed it and walked toward Jungkook. "I'd like you to have this." He blinked in surprise. "I can't." "You can." She gently placed the flower into his hand. "It reminds me that kindness doesn't always ask to be remembered." Jungkook looked down at the delicate bloom. Its fragrance carried a quiet sweetness that reminded him of spring mornings long ago. He smiled more brightly than he had all day. "Thank you." The minister glanced toward Jimin and his bride. "Would you like to continue the ceremony?" Jimin looked toward Jungkook. Instead of answering immediately, he asked softly, "Will you stay?" Jungkook looked around the church. Every seat was occupied. Every face was turned toward him. He instinctively shook his head. "I don't want to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." Jimin smiled warmly. "You're part of the story that brought all of us here." For a long moment, Jungkook couldn't find words. He had expected to leave quietly after returning the folder. Instead, he found himself being offered something he hadn't imagined possible. A place not in the past, but in the present. Slowly, he accepted the invitation. He walked to an empty seat near the front of the church, the leather folder now resting safely in Jimin's hands, while the lavender flower remained carefully tucked inside the pocket over his heart. As the music rose gently once more, and the minister prepared to continue the ceremony, sunlight finally broke through the last remaining clouds, filling the church with a soft golden glow that seemed to bless not only the beginning of a marriage, but also the quiet healing of hearts that had carried their unspoken burdens for far too long. The minister smiled gently before returning to his place at the altar. His voice, calm and reassuring, floated through the church with renewed warmth. Love, he began, is often remembered for the moments when people choose each other, but perhaps its greatest strength is revealed when people also choose forgiveness. The words settled softly over every guest. Jimin stood beside his bride once more, their hands intertwined. This time, however, there was no trace of uncertainty in his expression. The emotions awakened by Jungkook's return had not shaken his commitment, they had clarified it. He understood now that carrying gratitude for the past did not diminish the promise he was making for the future. His bride noticed the peaceful change in his eyes. She squeezed his hand gently. "You look different. I feel different. In a good way." Jimin smiled. "In the best way." The ceremony continued. When the minister invited the couple to share the vows they had written themselves, Jimin unfolded a neatly folded sheet of paper from his jacket. He paused before reading. "I spent weeks trying to write perfect words," he admitted with a soft laugh. Several guests smiled. "But today I realized perfection isn't what love asks of us." He looked into his bride's eyes. "It asks us to stay, even after life surprises us." She smiled through glistening tears. "I promise to stand beside you during ordinary mornings and extraordinary storms. I promise to celebrate your victories without envy, to comfort your fears without judgment, and to remind you who you are whenever the world makes you forget." His voice trembled only slightly. "I promise to keep choosing you, not because every day will be easy, but because every difficult day will still be worth facing together." Silence followed. Not an empty silence. A grateful one. His bride unfolded her own vows. "When I met you," she said softly, "I thought love was about finding someone who completed what was missing." She smiled warmly. "I was wrong." Jimin looked at her with quiet curiosity. "You weren't missing anything." She reached up and gently touched his hand. "You simply needed someone willing to walk beside the person you already were." Her words carried no grand drama. Only quiet truth. "I promise never to compete with your memories." Jimin blinked. "I promise to respect every chapter that shaped you before we met." A few guests quietly wiped away fresh tears. "And I promise that our future will never ask you to erase your past." Jimin's eyes shone with emotion. "I couldn't ask for anything more." The minister nodded with quiet satisfaction. "May your marriage always leave room for honesty." He turned another page. Before the exchange of rings, his voice paused. "There is a tradition I occasionally invite couples to follow." The guests listened attentively. "I ask whether anyone present wishes to offer a blessing." The church became still. Family members exchanged glances. An elderly grandmother slowly stood. She blessed the couple with a short prayer filled with hope. Jimin's younger cousin followed, recalling childhood memories that filled the room with gentle laughter. Then silence returned. Unexpectedly, Jimin looked toward the front row. His eyes met Jungkook's. "Would you?" He hesitated. "Say something." Jungkook looked genuinely startled. He instinctively shook his head. "I shouldn't. I'd like you to." His bride nodded. "So would I." The guests waited patiently. Jungkook slowly stood. His heartbeat echoed loudly inside his chest as he walked toward the front once more. Unlike before, every step felt lighter. He stood a respectful distance from the couple. For several moments he simply looked at them. Then he smiled. "When we were younger," he began quietly, "Jimin believed every important journey needed a map." Soft laughter spread across the church. "I disagreed." Jimin chuckled. "You absolutely did. I said maps only show roads other people already discovered." The guests listened with quiet attention. I believe the best journeys were the ones people created themselves. He glanced toward the newlyweds. I still believe that. His voice remained gentle. There will be mornings when you disagree. There will be evenings when silence feels easier than conversation. There will be seasons when life becomes so busy that love quietly waits in the background. He smiled. When those days arrive. He paused. Remember today. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass illuminated his face. Remember not the flowers. Not the music. Not even the photographs. He looked directly at both of them. Remember that two people stood here and promised to keep choosing each other. His words carried no sadness. Only hope. And whenever choosing becomes difficult. A small smile appeared. Choose one more day. Several guests nodded quietly. Then another. His eyes softened. And one day you'll look back and realize your marriage wasn't built during its happiest moments. It was built during the ordinary days when you quietly decided not to give up. The church remained completely silent. Not because people lacked words. Because every word already spoken felt enough. Jungkook took one small step backward. I wish both of you a lifetime filled with ordinary miracles. He smiled warmly. They're the ones that last the longest. The minister inclined his head respectfully. Thank you. Jungkook returned to his seat. As he sat down, he glanced through one of the church's tall windows. The rain had completely stopped. Outside, sunlight glittered across the wet stone path leading away from the chapel. For the first time in years, he realized he no longer felt as though he was standing outside someone else's happiness. Instead, he felt quietly grateful to have witnessed it, carrying within himself a peaceful certainty that some stories are not remembered because they end with dramatic twists, but because they leave every heart they touch a little kinder than before. The church bells rang with a rich, joyful melody that rolled across the valley the moment the minister declared them husband and wife. Their echoes drifted through the open doors, mingling with the scent of rain-soaked roses and fresh cedar carried by the afternoon breeze. For the first time that day, every face in the chapel relaxed into genuine smiles. Jimin and his wife stood together beneath the arch of white flowers, their hands still joined as though neither wished to let go. Applause slowly filled the sanctuary, not loud or overwhelming, but warm, sincere, and deeply heartfelt. Jungkook remained seated near the front. He clapped with everyone else. A quiet smile rested on his face. There was no bitterness hidden behind it. Only relief. The ceremony concluded, and the guests gradually made their way outside into the golden afternoon. The storm had washed the sky clean, leaving behind brilliant blue stretching endlessly above the surrounding hills. Tiny drops of water still clung to the leaves of the ancient oak trees surrounding the chapel, sparkling like scattered crystals whenever sunlight touched them. The reception was held in a nearby garden overlooking a peaceful lake. Long wooden tables were decorated with wildflowers, candles inside glass lanterns, and linen cloths that fluttered gently in the breeze. Soft piano music floated through the air while children laughed as they chased one another across the grass. For the first time in years, Jungkook felt comfortable among people again. Not invisible. Not forgotten. Simply present. He quietly walked toward the edge of the lake, away from the lively conversations. The surface of the water reflected the afternoon sky with perfect clarity. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. You always disappear during parties. Jungkook turned. Jimin smiled as he approached. I guess some habits survive everything. So do yours. They both laughed. For a few moments, they simply admired the peaceful lake before them. I used to think we'd have this conversation years ago, Jimin admitted. So did I. I imagined we'd argue. I imagined I'd lose. Jimin chuckled. You always hated arguments. I preferred fixing things. You were never good at saying that. No, Jungkook smiled. I was terrible. Silence settled comfortably between them. Unlike the silence they had carried for years, this one needed no explanation. Jimin reached into the inside pocket of his suit. I found something else inside the folder. Jungkook looked surprised. You did? Jimin carefully unfolded a faded photograph. The colors had softened with age. Two young men stood beside a tiny wooden cabin, laughing so hard that neither was looking at the camera. Behind them, a handmade sign read, "Dreams begin here." Jungkook's eyes widened. I thought I'd lost that. It was tucked behind one of the letters. Jimin gently smiled. We looked fearless. We were. We also looked ridiculous. We definitely were. They laughed together, the kind of laughter that arrives only after years of carrying emotions too heavy for words. Jimin looked down at the photograph again. Do you ever regret anything? Jungkook thought carefully before answering. I regret the silence. He looked toward the calm lake. But not the kindness. Jimin nodded slowly. I regret letting pride become louder than friendship. You were trying to survive. So were you. Neither tried to deny it. The truth no longer required defense. From across the garden, Jimin's wife waved cheerfully. They're about to cut the cake. Jimin smiled and waved back. I should go. Jungkook nodded. You should. Jimin hesitated. Will you come? I'll be there. Together they returned to the celebration. As the newlyweds stood beside the towering wedding cake, laughter spread through the garden once more. Friends teased them, family members shared stories from childhood, and cameras captured countless joyful moments beneath strings of glowing lights that had begun to shine as evening slowly approached. When it came time for speeches, Jimin unexpectedly walked onto the small wooden stage. He tapped the microphone gently. I wasn't planning another speech. The guests laughed. But today reminded me of something important. He looked around the garden before his eyes settled briefly on Jungkook. We often celebrate the people standing beside us. He smiled warmly. And we should. He paused. But sometimes we forget to thank the people who quietly helped us become the person standing here. Many guests followed his gaze toward Jungkook. Jimin continued. Every life is shaped by people who leave behind courage, kindness, patience, or forgiveness. He raised his glass. Today I want to thank every person who believed in me, even during the years when I wasn't very good at believing in myself. A gentle murmur of agreement spread through the gathering. Jimin's wife lifted her glass beside him. To every chapter. Everyone echoed together. To every chapter. Crystal glasses met with soft musical chimes. Jungkook quietly lifted his own glass. For years he had believed his role in Jimin's life had ended without a proper farewell. Now he understood something different. Not every meaningful relationship is meant to last in the same form forever. Some become memories. Some become lessons. Some quietly become the foundation upon which future happiness is built. As twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, tiny lanterns floating across the lake reflected like hundreds of gentle stars upon the water. Jungkook watched them drift peacefully into the distance. For the first time in a very long while, he did not feel the weight of what had been left behind. Instead, he felt grateful for everything that had remained. Night settled gently over the lakeside estate, wrapping the celebration in a quiet glow of golden lanterns and thousands of tiny lights hanging from the old oak trees. Music drifted softly across the water, while the laughter of family and friends blended with the rhythmic chirping of crickets hidden among the gardens. The wedding had become less of a formal celebration and more of a reunion of hearts, where every conversation seemed warmer than the last. Jungkook stood near the edge of the terrace, a cup of hot tea warming his hands. Unlike the sparkling drinks carried by most of the guests, he had always preferred tea, especially on evenings that invited reflection. It was an old habit Jimin knew well. You still choose tea over everything else. Jungkook turned with a smile. And you still notice. Jimin leaned against the wooden railing beside him. From there they could see the lake shimmering beneath the moonlight, its surface so still that it reflected the stars almost perfectly. I almost forgot how peaceful this feels, Jimin admitted. The silence. No, he smiled. Standing beside an old friend, without feeling like we have to explain every thought. Jungkook looked toward the water. Maybe that's what time gives us. What? The confidence to let silence speak. For a while they simply watched the floating lanterns drift farther across the lake. Finally, Jimin spoke again. I've been thinking about that cabin. Jungkook laughed quietly. I had a feeling you would. Is it really still standing? Barely. You kept repairing it. Every year. Even when you thought I'd never come back. Jungkook nodded. I made a promise. You really believe promises last that long? I believe people do. Jimin smiled. You've always been impossible. So I've been told. A gentle breeze carried the fragrance of lavender and pine through the garden. The bride approached them with 2 small dessert plates in her hands. I had a feeling neither of you remembered to eat. She handed 1 plate to Jungkook. He looked surprised. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He accepted it with a grateful smile. Thank you. She looked between the 2 old friends. You know. She laughed softly. I spent months wondering why Jimin sometimes became quiet whenever someone mentioned old memories. Jimin rubbed the back of his neck. I wasn't exactly good at explaining. No, she smiled teasingly. You definitely weren't. Turning to Jungkook, she continued. I understand now. He tilted his head. Understand what? That some people aren't remembered because we refuse to move on. She looked toward Jimin with affection. They're remembered because they helped us become who we are. Jungkook lowered his eyes for a moment. I never expected to hear that. She smiled warmly. I think gratitude and love can exist together. Jimin nodded. They're different things. But both deserve honesty. The 3 of them stood together beneath the lanterns, sharing quiet conversation that felt surprisingly natural. There was no awkwardness. No jealousy. Only mutual respect. A little girl suddenly ran toward them across the garden. She couldn't have been older than 7. She wore a pale blue dress and carried a tiny bouquet almost as large as herself. She stopped directly in front of Jungkook. Excuse me. He knelt slightly to meet her eyes. Yes, my mommy said. She hesitated shyly. You're the nice man. Jungkook blinked. The nice man. She nodded enthusiastically. The one who helped my cousin. His expression softened instantly. Before he could answer, a young woman hurried over. I'm so sorry. She laughed nervously. She overheard our conversation. Jungkook smiled reassuringly. It's all right. The woman looked emotional. I've wanted to thank you for months. You don't have to. I do. She took a deep breath. My niece is healthy now. Her voice trembled. She started school last week. Jungkook's smile widened. That's wonderful. She wants to become a doctor. He chuckled. That's an excellent dream. The little girl suddenly held out her bouquet. For you. Jungkook looked surprised. I can't take your flowers. You can. She nodded very seriously. I picked the prettiest ones. He accepted the tiny bouquet with both hands as though it were the most precious gift in the world. Thank you. She beamed. Then she hugged him unexpectedly before running back toward her family. Jungkook remained kneeling for a moment, looking at the small flowers now resting in his hands. They're beautiful, Jimin said quietly. They really are. His voice carried unmistakable emotion. The bride smiled gently. I think that little girl gave you exactly what you gave her family. Jungkook looked at her curiously. Hope. He stared at the bouquet for a long moment. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps kindness always found its way home. The music changed as the band began playing a slower melody. Several couples stepped onto the dance floor beneath the hanging lights. Jimin extended his hand toward his wife. May I? She laughed. I've been waiting all evening. Together they walked toward the center of the garden. As they danced, Jimin glanced briefly toward Jungkook. Their eyes met across the softly illuminated lawn. Neither needed words. The smile they exchanged carried everything left unsaid. Jungkook looked back toward the lake. The bouquet from the little girl rested gently beside the single lavender flower tucked into his jacket pocket. One represented gratitude from the past. The other represented hope for the future. For the first time in many years, he realized he was carrying both at once, and neither felt heavy anymore. The evening unfolded with an effortless warmth that no one had expected when the day had begun. The laughter echoing through the lakeside garden seemed brighter now, freed from the uncertainty that had briefly shadowed the wedding. Strings of golden lights swayed gently above the guests, their reflections dancing across the calm surface of the lake like countless tiny stars floating just beyond reach. Jungkook remained near the water, watching the celebration from a comfortable distance. He had always preferred observing to being the center of attention. It allowed him to notice the little things others often missed. The bride's father quietly helping an elderly guest with her chair. A young boy secretly slipping extra slices of cake onto his sister's plate. The flower girls chasing glowing fireflies instead of sitting politely at their table. Ordinary moments. The kind Jungkook believed became life's greatest treasures. A familiar melody suddenly drifted through the garden. Jimin looked toward the small live band in surprise. They're playing our old favorite. Jungkook laughed softly. I haven't heard that song in years. I requested it. Jungkook looked at him. You did. Jimin nodded. I remembered it this morning. You always forgot the lyrics. I still do. Both of them laughed. The bride walked over with an amused smile. I was wondering why he insisted on adding one mysterious song to the playlist. Jimin rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't know if you'd actually come. Jungkook smiled gently. I'm glad I did. So am I. The band continued playing the gentle instrumental melody while several older guests hummed along, recognizing the tune from years gone by. Jimin suddenly reached into his pocket once again. This belongs with you. He held out the faded photograph they had found inside the folder. Jungkook shook his head. No, you should keep it. So should you. It was yours. It became ours the moment it was taken. Jimin looked down at the smiling younger versions of themselves. Then let's not separate it again. He walked to the guest book placed beside the entrance of the reception hall. Opening it to the final blank page, he carefully tucked the photograph inside. There. Jungkook smiled curiously. Why there? So every anniversary. Jimin looked toward his wife. When we read the messages everyone wrote today. He gently closed the book. We'll remember where this new chapter truly began. His wife rested her hand on top of the guest book. I love that. Jungkook's eyes softened. So do I. A few nearby guests quietly witnessed the gesture. None interrupted. Some memories deserved only respectful silence. As the evening continued, the master of ceremonies announced one final tradition. We've prepared a small memory lantern for each guest. Volunteers began distributing delicate paper lanterns, with tiny candles protected inside glass holders. Each lantern came with a small blank card. The host smiled warmly. Write one hope. No names. No speeches. Just one hope for tomorrow. Pens were passed around the garden. Guests quietly wrote. Some finished quickly, Others stared thoughtfully at the tiny cards for several minutes. Jimin smiled as he folded his card. His wife kissed his cheek before placing hers inside the lantern. Jungkook looked at his own blank card. For a long moment he wrote nothing. Then, with slow, careful handwriting, he pennied a single sentence. May every goodbye leave enough kindness to become a beautiful memory. He folded the card, placed it inside, closed the lantern. When everyone was ready, the host counted softly. 3, 2, 1. Hundreds of lanterns were gently released onto the quiet lake. One after another they floated away, tiny lights spreading across the water until the lake resembled a sky turned upside down. The guests watched in complete silence. No applause followed. Only wonder. Jimin stood beside his wife with his arm around her shoulders. Jungkook stood a few steps away. Different places, the same horizon. The lanterns drifted farther into the night, carried by a slow current neither hurried nor uncertain. Jimin spoke quietly without looking away from the water. Do you know what? I used to think closure meant forgetting. Jungkook smiled faintly. I used to think it meant leaving. And now? Jungkook watched his lantern disappear among hundreds of others. Now I think. He paused. Closure is being able to wish someone happiness without wishing the story had been different. Jimin nodded slowly. I couldn't have said it better. His wife reached for both of their hands. For one brief moment the three of them stood connected beneath the moonlit sky, united not by the past alone, but by the peace they had chosen in the present. Far across the lake, the last traces of sunset faded completely, giving way to a sky filled with brilliant stars. Jungkook looked upward. He remembered the promise they had once made as teenagers beneath another sky full of stars, that no matter where life carried them, they would become people their younger selves could be proud of. He smiled, not because every dream had come true, but because, in ways neither of them could have imagined, that promise had quietly survived. The celebration slowly drew to a close as the last song faded into the peaceful rhythm of the night. Guests began embracing one another, exchanging warm farewells before making their way toward waiting cars along the tree-lined driveway. The lanterns still floated across the lake, their soft lights growing smaller as they drifted into the distance, like quiet wishes carried by the current. The garden, once filled with music and laughter, became calm. Only a few people remained. Jimin, his wife, Jungkook, and their closest family members. The air smelled of damp grass, lavender, and the faint sweetness of wedding flowers that had begun to close for the evening. Jimin loosened his tie and laughed. I forgot how exhausting smiling all day could be. His wife gently nudged his shoulder. You smiled because you wanted to. I know. He looked at her affectionately. And I'd do it again. She smiled back. I'm holding you to that. Their laughter echoed softly across the quiet garden. Jungkook watched them with genuine happiness. There was something comforting about seeing two people laugh so naturally together. It reminded him that love did not need grand gestures every day. Sometimes it simply sounded like shared laughter after a very long day. The wedding planner approached carrying a small wooden box. Excuse me. She smiled apologetically. We found this behind the stage. Jimin looked at the familiar carving on the lid. His eyes widened. It can't be. Jungkook recognized it instantly. The tiny compass carved into one corner. The faded initials burned into the wood years ago. The memory box. The planner blinked. You know what this is? Jimin laughed in disbelief. I haven't seen it in years. Jungkook gently touched the lid. It was inside the cabin. I thought it stayed there. It did. They looked at each other with the same question. How had it arrived here? The planner smiled. An elderly gentleman delivered it this afternoon. He said it belonged at today's wedding. Jimin frowned thoughtfully. Did he leave his name? She shook her head. He simply smiled and said, "She tried to remember. Some promises deserve front row seats." Jungkook's eyes slowly filled with recognition. "The caretaker." Jimin looked surprised. "Mr. Han." Jungkook nodded. He must have realized what today meant. The planner excused herself, leaving the wooden box in their care. For a few moments none of them spoke. The box was exactly as they remembered. Its edges had faded. The brass lock had darkened with age. But it remained remarkably well preserved. Jimin carefully inserted the old silver key. It fit perfectly. A gentle click echoed through the quiet garden. Slowly, the lid opened. Inside rested dozens of memories. Old train tickets. A faded concert wristband. Tiny seashells collected during a summer trip. Pressed wildflowers wrapped carefully between notebook pages. A disposable camera. A folded paper crane. And beneath everything else, 2 small notebooks. One labeled Jimin asterisk. The other, Jungkook. Jimin picked up his notebook carefully. "I completely forgot we wrote these." "So did I." They opened them together. The pages were filled with dreams written by much younger versions of themselves. Some were ambitious. Some were wonderfully unrealistic. Some were beautifully simple. Travel somewhere I've never been. Learn to forgive quickly. Never become too busy for people I love. Build a home filled with laughter. Jimin smiled. "I managed a few." Jungkook nodded. "So did I." They continued reading. Occasionally laughing. Occasionally growing quiet. Until Jimin reached the final page of his notebook. There was one sentence written in large, uneven handwriting. "If I ever become someone different." He smiled. "I hope I become someone kinder." He looked toward Jungkook. "I'd forgotten this." Jungkook quietly replied, "I don't think you did." Jimin looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You became exactly that person." Jimin lowered his eyes. "I wasn't always kind." "No." Jungkook smiled gently. "But you kept trying." Jimin closed the notebook. "And you." Jungkook opened the final page of his own. He laughed softly. "My handwriting was terrible." "It still is." They laughed together. His final sentence read, "If life separates us, I hope we'll meet again without anger." Silence followed. Jimin looked at him. "I guess." He smiled warmly. "And you got your wish." Jungkook nodded. "I guess I did." The bride quietly watched the exchange. She realized she wasn't witnessing 2 people trapped by the past. She was witnessing 2 people finally setting it down. She stepped closer. "I think these belong somewhere safer." Jimin agreed. "Our home." Jungkook looked surprised. "You should keep them." "We will." Jimin smiled. "But not hidden away. We'll put them on the bookshelf." His wife nodded. "So that one day." She looked toward the quiet lake. "If our children ever ask what friendship really means." She gently rested her hand on the wooden box. "We'll have a story worth telling." Jungkook stood silently for a moment. Then he smiled. The deepest, most peaceful smile anyone had seen from him that day. For years he had feared those memories would eventually disappear. Instead, they had found a new home. Not locked inside an abandoned cabin. Not hidden inside forgotten letters. But preserved in the lives of people who had finally learned that the most meaningful promises are not the ones that keep us tied to the past, but the ones that quietly teach us how to walk into the future with gratitude, forgiveness, and hearts finally free. The wedding venue awoke beneath the first light of dawn. A pale golden sunrise spread across the lake, turning the quiet water into a mirror of soft amber and silver. The lanterns that had floated through the night had long since disappeared beyond the reeds, but a few white petals still rested upon the shore, gently carried back by the morning tide. Most of the guests had already returned home. The laughter that had filled the gardens the previous evening had become a peaceful silence. Only birds greeted the new day. Jungkook stood alone on the wooden pier, both hands resting lightly on the weathered railing. He had always loved mornings. Unlike sunsets which reminded him of endings, sunrises carried no expectations. Only possibilities. Behind him came the quiet sound of footsteps. "I knew I'd find you here." Jimin smiled as he approached, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You still wake up before everyone else." Jungkook accepted one of the cups. "And you still remember how I take it?" "Without sugar." "You remembered." "I remember more than I realized." They stood side by side, watching thin mist drift lazily across the lake. The air smelled of pine, fresh earth, and dew-covered grass. For several peaceful minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt complete. Eventually Jimin broke it. "I kept thinking about something you said yesterday." Jungkook looked at him. "Which part?" "Choose one more day." A faint smile crossed Jungkook's face. "I almost forgot saying that." "I didn't." Jimin stared toward the horizon. "I think that's why we are standing here." "What do you mean?" "We stopped choosing." Jungkook lowered his eyes. "Maybe. We let silence make decisions for us." Jungkook nodded slowly. "It happens more often than people admit." Jimin sighed. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." "So do I." Neither tried to change the past. Neither searched for someone to blame. Some truths no longer required apologies. Only acceptance. After finishing his coffee, Jimin reached into his coat pocket. "I have something for you." Jungkook looked surprised. "You've already given me enough." "This isn't repayment." He handed over a small envelope. Jungkook frowned slightly. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside rested a simple brass key attached to a leather tag. Unlike the old silver key from the memory box, this one looked new. Jungkook looked at him in confusion. "What does it open?" "Our front door." Jungkook blinked. "What?" Jimin laughed. "Not to live there." Jungkook looked relieved and amused at the same time. "I was about to say that would be very strange." "It would." Both laughed. Jimin continued. "Our home is always open to you." Jungkook stared at the key. "I can't accept this." "You can." "No, I insist." Jungkook looked uncertain. "Why?" Jimin answered honestly. "Because I don't ever want distance to become silence again." The words lingered between them. Jungkook closed his fingers around the key. It felt unexpectedly warm. "I'll probably never use it." "I know. But you'll know you can." That was enough. Far behind them, the bride stepped onto the terrace carrying a camera. She smiled as she spotted them. "Don't move." Both men turned instinctively. Click. The shutter captured the quiet morning. No ceremony. No crowd. No carefully arranged poses. Just 2 old friends standing beside a peaceful lake beneath the first sunrise, after a wedding that had changed all of them. She lowered the camera with satisfaction. "I like that one." Jimin laughed. "You haven't even looked at it." "I don't need to." She smiled. "Some photographs are beautiful because of the people inside them." Jungkook smiled shyly. "You've become quite philosophical." She laughed. "I married him yesterday." She pointed playfully toward Jimin. "It's impossible not to." They all laughed together. Later that morning after breakfast, cars slowly departed one by one. Suitcases were loaded. Goodbyes were exchanged. The wedding venue gradually emptied. Finally, only one car remained waiting near the entrance. Jungkook placed his small travel bag into the trunk. Jimin walked over. So, you'll call. I will. You promise? Jungkook smiled. I've learned not to make promises lightly. Jimin nodded. Fair enough. Jungkook extended his hand. Jimin ignored it completely. Instead, he pulled him into another warm embrace. This is becoming a habit. It is. I'm not complaining. They stepped back smiling. Jimin's wife joined them. She hugged Jungkook too. Take care of yourself. I will. And don't disappear for another year. He laughed. I'll do my best. As Jungkook climbed into the driver's seat, he looked once more at the peaceful estate. The chapel, the gardens, the lake, the place where unfinished conversations had finally found their ending. He started the engine. The car rolled slowly down the winding road lined with tall maple trees. In the rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse of Jimin and his wife standing together, waving until the car disappeared beyond the hill. Jungkook smiled. Not because he was leaving, but because, for the first time in many years, leaving no longer felt like losing. It simply felt like continuing the journey, carrying with him not the weight of old regrets, but the quiet certainty that some people remain part of our lives not through constant presence, but through the kindness they leave behind, a kindness that continues to guide every road long after the footsteps themselves have faded. Several months passed, and autumn quietly painted the countryside in shades of gold, amber, and crimson. The wedding had become a cherished memory, spoken of not because of unexpected drama, but because everyone who had attended had left with a different understanding of love. Life settled into its gentle rhythm. Jimin and his wife built a home exactly as they had promised one another, one filled with laughter, honest conversations, open windows, fresh flowers on the dining table, and music playing softly on peaceful Sunday mornings. The old wooden memory box found its place on a bookshelf in the living room. It was never hidden. Whenever sunlight streamed through the windows, the brass lock reflected a warm golden glow, quietly reminding them that every beautiful future is shaped by the stories that came before it. Jungkook, meanwhile, found himself changing in ways he had never expected. He traveled less. He stayed in one city long enough to recognize the familiar faces at the neighborhood cafe. He volunteered at the children's hospital every Saturday, reading stories to young patients and helping organize charity events without ever seeking recognition. His happiest moments became the simplest ones. A child laughing after recovering from illness. An elderly stranger smiling during a quiet conversation. A sunrise watched from a park bench with a cup of warm tea in his hands. One crisp autumn afternoon, an envelope arrived at his apartment. There was no return address. He immediately recognized the handwriting. Jimin. Inside was a single photograph. It was the picture Jimin's wife had taken on the morning after the wedding. Two friends standing beside a peaceful lake, coffee cups in their hands, smiling naturally beneath the first light of dawn. On the back, Jimin had written only one sentence. Some friendships don't need constant conversation to remain true. Jungkook smiled. He placed the photograph into a simple wooden frame and set it on the bookshelf beside his favorite novels. Not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a celebration of what had been found again. The seasons continued to change. Winter covered the mountains with snow. Spring filled the gardens with blossoms. Summer returned with long evenings and gentle breezes. Time moved forward exactly as it always had. But this time none of them feared it. On the first anniversary of the wedding, Jimin and his wife invited their closest family and friends to a small dinner by the same lakeside where they had celebrated the beginning of their marriage. There were no elaborate decorations, no orchestra, no grand speeches. Only homemade food, warm laughter, and familiar faces gathered around one long wooden table beneath strings of glowing lights. Jungkook arrived carrying a small potted maple sapling. "I thought flowers would fade," he said with a shy smile. "So I brought something that grows." Jimin accepted the gift carefully. "We'll plant it together." They chose a quiet spot overlooking the lake. Side by side, the three of them dug a small hole in the soft earth. Jimin lowered the young tree into place. His wife covered the roots with soil. Jungkook poured the first bucket of water. When they finished, the little tree stood straight beneath the evening sky, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. "It'll take years before it becomes large," Jimin said. Jungkook smiled. "The best things usually do." And as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, everyone gathered around the tree. No one said very much. They simply stood together, appreciating the quiet beauty of the moment. The lake reflected the colors of the sunset, just as it had on the day of the wedding. Only now everything felt lighter. The old misunderstandings had become wisdom. The unanswered questions had become acceptance. The painful silence had become peaceful understanding. Jimin looked toward Jungkook. "Thank you." Jungkook smiled. "For what?" "For coming to the wedding." He laughed softly. "I almost turned around." "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I." The evening breeze gently stirred the branches of the newly planted maple. Its tiny leaves shimmered beneath the fading light, full of promise for seasons yet to come. Years later, visitors walking beside the lake would often stop beneath the shade of a magnificent maple tree that overlooked the water. Few would know who planted it. Fewer still would know why. But those who did remembered that it stood as a quiet symbol of forgiveness, gratitude, and the rare courage to let love transform rather than divide. Because in the end, the greatest secret Jungkook carried into Jimin's wedding was never hidden inside an old folder, a forgotten letter, or a silver key. It was the simple truth that kindness, when given without expecting anything in return, has the extraordinary power to change not only one ending, but every beginning that follows. And so their story did not end with a farewell. It ended with peace. A peace earned through honesty, strengthened by forgiveness, and carried forward by three people who understood that the most enduring relationships are not defined by possession, but by respect, compassion, and the quiet choice to wish one another happiness, today, tomorrow, and for every season still waiting beyond the horizon. The end.